Hey everybody, welcome to Staff Talk this week. This is episode 5, and we are talking about were Adam and Eve real people?
It's a big one. We wanted to start by reading the first chapter of Adam Hamilton's Making Sense of the Bible, and it starts off with, it says, an old friend called one day. She was in an in-depth Bible study that suggested the story of Adam and Eve was not a historian's account of the first two humans, but instead of an archetypal story about human condition. She was unsettled by this. She felt her faith was being challenged and stretched too far. She told me that she had always taken these stories at face value as describing historical events and had not considered that might be something else. She asked, does that mean that Adam and Eve weren't real people?
So I guess if you're going to consider whether Adam and Eve were real people, you have to think about some things we know about science. And Adam talks about some of this stuff in the book. He talks about the idea that we can find fossils of people who are humanoid-looking people as far as back as almost 200,000 years ago. Of course, they might have looked like us. They didn't think like us or act like us, but they started to progress, and we can know about 40,000 years ago is when we find that humans started to use fire and tools and even
instruments.
It was this big explosion of thought from there going forward. And the idea is that maybe how do you square that with the idea that Adam and Eve were the first people, and if you go back, the flat Earth, or the young Earth people will tell you that according to the timeline of the Bible, the Earth should only be about 7,000 years old. So what do you do with that information as a Christian, and how do you deal with that? And when you find yourself with questions like this, are Adam and Eve real people? It can be unsettling, and I thought maybe we could talk today a little bit about some times when we encountered those kinds of things. Like, I mean, when you first heard this, did it really unsettle you a lot?
Well, I mean, I grew up like most kids in our church do, is that we hear all these stories and we hear them all the time, and like we get used to hearing them, we don't think of anything of them. But then I can remember, I was an adult and someone was like, I guess it was when we looked at the first two, like the creation stories, and that those don't really add up, and were Adam and Eve real? And it wasn't like it was terrifying or made me doubt my faith, but it was just like, oh, okay, I guess that makes sense that they weren't really real, that it's this archetypal story of how God loved us so much, He created us and put us into being.
We missed some context from earlier chapters since we've kind of skipped around. And one of the chapters, Adam talks about the name Adam, which really is the word from Adam in Hebrew, which is just the word for man. It's a very generic name that would mean man. And Eve also, I'm not sure remember what Eve stands for, but they're both symbolic names. And so it would be interesting to see them in a symbolic way. But what about you, Tiffany? Did that ever, something like this ever unsettle you? I mean, because it can have an unsettling effect when you thought this your whole life, and then all of a sudden you're asked to think about these things.
I think probably most of my experience with it is the conversation I have with kids when they start thinking about it.
Okay,
and trying to explain that it's okay to be unsettled by it.
And I think it's a good time to talk about an idea that there's this idea called pre-critical naivete, which is like before you're able to really to think, and this is how we give the stories to kids, because they believe in things like the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus, and they just take it at face value because that's what we told them. Right. And the same thing's true about the Adam and Eve story, and we teach it to them in a pre-critical kind of thinking way.
And you'll have parents actually say that when they told their kids about some of these things, like Easter Bunny and things like that their kids will go back and say, well, then was this real? And was that? It questions a lot of different things than just...
And so somewhere in our life, we move from this pre-critical naivete where we believe in Santa and those things, and we start to question things. And one of the things that can be unsettling in that is when you start to question things, you can get this real, I call it a guttural reaction to things sounding different than what you've been told your whole life. It can be very unsettling. It can feel heretical. You could even maybe even see the title of this week's talk and think, I'm not touching that because that's heretical. That's against everything I've ever turned. And if you only let your gut reaction to that be what drives you, you're going to find yourself in trouble because you have a hard time. We're still having trouble lining up science and the Bible again here. And so you begin to think critically about the Bible and about science and those things. And then what happens is you at some point you have to move past critical thinking to what's called post-critical naivete, which is I've questioned things, I've examined them, and I've gotten to a place where I'm still okay with a little mystery, and I'm still okay with a little with everything not making perfect sense. And so that's where I am with Adam and Eve, and whether they're real people. I'm in that post-critical naivete period, which says, I don't really know. I can see how you can make an argument either way, but either way, it doesn't matter, because it's the story, whether it's factual or not, is still true.
Right.
And so that God made us out of something, nothing, and God breathed life into us, whether it was through evolution, whatever the case may be, and then we turn away.
Right.
And so in some ways, Adam and Eve's story is our story, right?
Right. It's us.
And so I think the point is not to get stuck on whether Adam and Eve were actual real people, but to really ask the question, why were they, and who were they, and how were they, and how does that fit in my life and my story? And so I think when you start to do that, they become much more important figures than just a simple story.
Right.
And so what does Adam have to say about
So at the end of the chapter, Adam Hamilton discusses whether Adam and Eve were people, or try to answer her question. And he says, "So, to my friend who asked if Adam and Eve were real people, my answer was, the Genesis 2 and 3 story of Adam and Eve and how they succumbed to temptation was not written to be a journalist or biographer's eyewitness account of the first two humans. Adam and Eve represent all of us. Nevertheless, it seems to me that their story is, in a very real way, the story of the earliest modern humans and how God gave them a soul, and of their tragic decision to turn from God's will, a decision that brought with this pain, shame, alienation, and death."
I actually was watching a documentary that Virginia turned me on to yesterday, and one of the quotes in there I thought really fit well with what we're talking about today, this idea of the story of science and the story of the Bible and how they interact. And as Christians, we live in the interaction of those two places. And you can, as she said, you can be a scientist without a soul and be all mindful, and everything's, has to do with logic and science and all that. Or you can be a Christian over here with all soul and no mind.
Yeah.
But to be a true human is to have both soul and mind, and to experience ourselves in true as God intended for us to be. We have to use both of those. And I think when you do that, you can't help but start to question, were Adam and Eve real people? But in the end, for us, I think all of us, it doesn't really matter. No. It's the story is true as it's written, whether it's factual or not. And so we hope that I guess, and I don't want to say that we're not trying to put our opinions on anybody. This is just us talking each week about the book that we're reading together, and hoping that you can learn from it too. And so if you ever have questions, or if anything puts you on, as we say, tilt, puts you on tilt and causes you to question things that are really difficult, call me, okay? We'll talk. I don't want you to feel like you're being pushed out into a territory with no life raft, to be like you're causing because I can remember being in seminary and feeling that way, getting that guttural reaction to these things they were saying that I were so different that I'd heard my whole life. And so if you feel that way, don't hesitate to call me, 479-899-3963, or anytime, or call the church if you catch us here. But we hope you're enjoying these, and I'm enjoying doing them with you guys. And so thanks for tuning in for another edition. And we'll say goodbye today.
And next week, we're going to be talking about, were there dinosaurs on the ark?
Dun, dun, dun.
What?